Welcome to another deep dive. We're gonna unpack this really interesting paper someone sent in, Conceptualizing Psychopathy, an overview by Theodoros Papagathonikou.
Okay.
It's dense.
It is.
So many fascinating insights, but it can be easy to get lost in the weeds.
Absolutely.
But that's why we're here, right? To separate the facts from the fiction.
Yeah, unpack it a little bit.
When it comes to psychopathy.
Yeah, psychopathy is one of those things that's just so often misunderstood.
Totally.
And what I find really interesting about this paper is how it kind of takes us on this historical journey.
Okay.
Of how our understanding of psychopathy has evolved over literally centuries.
Okay, a journey through time, you've got my attention.
Right.
Because, we're talking about a concept that the paper mentions goes all the way back to the early 1800s.
Right.
That's before we even really understood how the brain worked.
Oh, yeah.
Like the way we're starting to now.
Right. They were really just working with observation.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out why people behaved in certain ways. And one of the people highlighted in the paper is Philippe Pinel.
Okay.
Who was a psychiatrist working in that era. And he came up with this term, manie sans delire, to try to categorize what he was seeing.
Manie sans delire. Okay, I'm going to need a translation on that one.
Right, so it basically translates to insanity without delusion.
Okay.
And what Pinel noticed was that these individuals were behaving in ways that were impulsive, self-destructive sometimes, but they weren't detached from reality in the way that you might see with other forms of mental illness at the time.
So they weren't necessarily having hallucinations or delusions, but their behavior was still very clearly different.
Exactly. And what he really honed in on was this emotional deficit that was driving those behaviors rather than just the actions themselves.
Interesting. So he was looking at the root cause.
Yeah, like what was going on beneath the surface.
And this was groundbreaking for the time because it challenged those existing notions of what constituted mental illness.
Exactly. He was saying there's more to this than just outward behavior.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got Pinel laying some groundwork here, but then the paper dives into this whole concept of moral insanity, which to me, that just seems like a loaded term.
I agree. And the author of the paper actually argues that while the intention behind using moral insanity might have been to highlight these emotional differences that I know was talking about, it kind of created a whole other problem.
Because it implies judgment, right? Like you're saying someone's morally bad versus having a legitimate mental health condition.
Right, exactly. It's like saying someone with a broken leg is morally inferior because they can't walk as fast.
Exactly.
It's not really about morality. It's about a difference in how someone functions.
Okay. And unfortunately, that's baggage that we still carry today.
We really do.
Because you still see that misconception that psychopathy and just being antisocial are the same thing.
Right, and those two things are not the same.
Not even close.
It's comparing apples and oranges. They might both be fruit.
Right.
But they're very different.
So how do we move away from this loaded term, moral insanity, towards a more nuanced understanding?
Well, that's where the work of Hervey Cleckley in the 20th century becomes crucial.
Okay.
He really shifted the focus.
Yep.
And his book, The Mask of Sanity, is kind of like a game changer in the field.
The Mask of Sanity, just the title alone is intriguing.
Right.
Because it suggests there's something hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly.
So what did Cleckley bring to the table that was so groundbreaking? It really does make you think, how good are we at spotting these things right? Like, if someone's wearing this mask of sanity, how do we even know?
Right, and that was kind of his point.
Yeah.
Cleckley really moved away from that narrow focus on just criminal behavior.
Yeah.
He really dug deep into the emotional and psychological traits of these individuals that he classified as psychopaths. Yeah. And he described this picture of someone who could appear completely normal on the surface.
Ah, okay.
Hence the mask.
So they blend in, they could even be quite charming, but underneath it, something's off.
Exactly. They often possess this superficial charm.
Yeah.
Yeah. They could be very articulate. They might present themselves as successful. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, there's this profound lack of genuine emotion.
Okay.
And in his book, Cleckley actually outlines 16 diagnostic criteria.
Wow.
And they paint a very different picture than the stereotypical crazed killer image we often have.
Okay, so we gotta dive into some of these classic Cleckley observations now. What were some of the hallmarks of this mask? Give me some specifics.
Well, he talks about their inability to form genuine emotional bonds with other people.
Okay.
This lack of empathy, which can be quite pronounced.
Yeah.
They often don't experience remorse or guilt in the way that most people do. And he also observed this tendency towards impulsive behavior, irresponsibility, and often repeating the same mistakes without really seeming to learn from them.
Interesting. So it's like they don't have that internal moral compass.
Yeah, you could say that.
That's guiding their decisions.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting, is Cleckley didn't believe that all psychopaths were destined for a life of crime.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Did you just say not all psychopaths are criminals?
Yeah.
Because that kind of goes against everything we see in movies on TV.
Right.
It's like the Hannibal Lecter effect. Correct?
Exactly. And popular culture loves to portray them as criminal masterminds. But Cleckley recognized it was way more complex than that.
Okay.
He even talks about how their personal relationships, for example, often seemed very, like, impersonal and trivial and poorly integrated. It wasn't so much about, like, this calculated seduction as it was about this real lack of depth in their experiences.
So if not all psychopaths are criminals, then what's the deciding factor?
Right.
What makes someone with these traits, more likely to end up in trouble with the law versus, I don't know, becoming a successful entrepreneur?
Right. Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something researchers are still trying to figure out. And this is where the paper introduces the work of Robert Hare.
Okay.
Who took Cleckley's observations and actually developed a way to kind of measure these traits.
Okay.
He created what's known as the Psychopathy Checklist-Revised, or the PCL-R.
The PCL-R, yeah, I've definitely heard of that. That's considered like the gold standard, right?
It is.
For assessing psychopathy, especially, I think, in criminal justice settings.
Yes, very much so, and it's incredibly influential.
Yeah.
So Hare basically took what Cleckley had observed.
Okay.
And he turned it into this standardized checklist of 20 personality traits of behaviors.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Things like glibness and superficial charm.
Okay.
A lack of empathy or remorse, impulsivity.
Yeah.
A parasitic lifestyle.
Wow.
Even criminal versatility.
So he found a way to actually quantify those traits that Cleckley had identified.
He did.
That's fascinating. And I imagine useful for research, but also, like I said, in risk assessment.
Exactly. And it has been very useful, but it's not without its criticisms.
Okay.
And the paper does point this out, that some argue that it oversimplifies what's obviously a very complex condition.
Right.
And there's this debate about whether it places too much emphasis on criminal behavior, which could potentially lead to overdiagnosis in certain populations.
Right. It's like that saying, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly.
Just because someone cuts you off in traffic doesn't mean they're a psychopath.
Exactly.
Right,
we have to be careful not to pathologize every human flaw.
Okay, so we've got the PCL-R, and like you said, it's got its pros and cons.
Right.
But it seems like what you're saying is this debate about the connection between psychopathy and criminality.
Yeah.
The paper seems to go back and forth on that a little bit.
It does.
So, like, what's the verdict? Are they inherently dangerous or not?
Well, it's complicated. On the one hand, research does show a clear correlation between high scores in the PCL-R and criminal behavior, especially when it comes to violent offenses. People with those high scores are statistically more likely to reoffend and engage in violence.
That makes sense. I mean, intuitively, if you lack empathy and you're highly impulsive, you're probably more likely to break the rules or to hurt someone else.
You're getting it. But here's the nuance.
Okay.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right.
Just because there's a link doesn't mean it's a one-to-one relationship.
Got it.
Not everyone with psychopathic traits will become a criminal.
Right.
And not all criminals are psychopaths.
Yeah.
There are other factors at play here, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, things like environmental influences, early childhood experiences.
Yeah.
Potentially even biological predispositions.
So it's that age-old nature versus nurture debate playing out in a very specific context. Now, speaking of nature, the paper did touch on some of the neurobiological research being done on psychopathy. Anything in there that stood out to you?
Well, there's this growing body of evidence that suggests that certain areas of the brain, particularly the amygdala, which is involved in processing emotions like fear and empathy, might function differently in individuals with psychopathic traits.
So you're saying their brains are literally wired differently?
I mean, it's not quite as simple as saying wired differently. But there are definitely differences in brain activity and structure that researchers are working hard to understand.
So it's like comparing, I don't know, a traditional combustion engine to an electric one? both can power a car, but they operate very differently under the hood.
Exactly. And what's important to emphasize here is that we've come a long way since Pinel's time.
Right.
Back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But there's still so much we don't know about psychopathy.
Yeah.
The causes effective treatments. It's a condition that continues to both fascinate and challenge our understanding of human behavior.
Which is why this deep dive is so important.
It is.
But with all this information swirling around, where do we even begin to land?
Right.
What are the key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway here is nuance.
Okay.
Psychopathy is not this black and white good versus evil kind of thing.
Yeah.
It exists on a spectrum.
Okay.
And it's far more complicated than most people realize.
Okay, so much for those true crime documentaries that promise us easy answers.
Right. It's dangerous and misleading to judge someone solely based on their outward behavior.
Right.
Without understanding the potential underlying factors at play.
And I think it's also important to remember that while psychopathy is often linked to criminal behavior,
yes,
not every individual with these traits is destined for a life of crime.
Right.
Some people with psychopathic traits might be functioning, quote unquote, quite well in society.
Right.
Even if their emotional landscape looks a little different from the norm.
Exactly. And I think that leads us to some even bigger questions.
Like what?
Well, if someone's brain is essentially wired differently due to factors outside of their control, can we truly hold them morally accountable?
Yeah.
In the same way as someone who had, a more typical upbringing.
That is a profound ethical dilemma.
It is.
And it's something that the legal system has been grappling with for a long time.
Right. And that complexity is something we should all be aware of.
Yeah, it's a question that has huge implications.
It really does.
For everything from how we think about criminal justice to,
absolutely.
How we approach mental health treatment and intervention and all of that.
Yeah. And while this paper doesn't necessarily give us all the answers,
right,
it really underscores the need for a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of this really complex condition.
Because we have to remember, psychopathy, however it develops, can often be linked to harmful behavior.
Right. You can't excuse harmful actions.
Right.
But at the same time, understanding the roots of it can help us potentially develop more effective interventions.
Exactly. And hopefully reduce the amount of suffering. Absolutely.
In the world.
Yeah.
Both for potential victims, but also for those who might be struggling with these traits themselves.
Right. We want to move away from those old stereotypes of just, labeling and punishing.
Right.
And really approach this with, scientific curiosity and a genuine desire to help.
100%. Now, the paper seems to hint that maybe the origins of psychopathy might actually lie in childhood experiences.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's definitely an area of ongoing research.
Sure.
The relationship between certain childhood experiences and the development of psychopathic traits is complex. It's not fully understood.
Right.
But there is some evidence to suggest that, early trauma neglect or even just inconsistent parenting could play a role. So it's not as simple as saying like, oh, there's a psychopath gene.
Right, exactly.
It's more nuanced than that.
They're more nuanced.
It's like maybe certain experiences in those really early formative years can actually shape how someone develops both emotionally and behaviorally.
Right. It's that nature versus nurture debate again.
Right.
And, both genetics and environment probably play a role.
Right.
But, yeah, imagine a child who grows up in a very chaotic or abusive household.
Right.
Their brain might actually adapt to that environment.
Okay.
In ways that could manifest as some of these traits that we've been discussing.
Interesting.
Lack of empathy, difficulty forming healthy attachments.
Right.
Even this kind of disconnect between their actions and the impact on others.
Which brings us right back to that crucial distinction between a mental difference and a moral failing.
Exactly.
Right. Because if someone's brain has developed differently due to factors that are largely outside of their control, can we really hold them morally responsible?
It's a tough one.
In the same way that we might someone else.
That is, I think, at the heart of the matter. And it's a question that, philosophers and legal scholars have been wrestling with for centuries. And this paper doesn't give us any easy answers, but it does highlight the need for, ongoing dialogue and a deeper understanding of these complexities.
It's about recognizing that people are not always simply good or bad. And there's a whole spectrum of human experience.
Absolutely.
And sometimes the lines are blurry.
Well said. I think this deep dive has given us a lot to ponder.
It's definitely given me a whole new perspective. That's for sure. I think from now on, I'm going to be watching all those true crime documentaries with a much more critical eye.
Yeah.
Asking myself, like, okay, what's the whole story here?
Right.
What factors might have contributed to this person's behavior?
Exactly. What are we not seeing?
Right, exactly.